Um, so, this afternoon's session, the Buffett, is on reverse engineering. We have Chris Eagle, who's an instructor, senior lecturer at the Naval Postgraduate School, which is a school that kicks ass in more ways than one. And Pedram Amini, who's a security researcher, among other things, working for Tipping Point. So be sure to interact with them. This is a BOF session, and have a good time.
I'd like to thank you all for turning out, because this is a pretty good crowd for a BOF. I'd like to emphasize that it is a BOF and not a talk. So we do want to encourage a two-way communication here, and we're not up here to pimp our latest projects too much. Disclaimer is that, sorry SANS, but it's recently come to our attention that SANS now offers a reverse engineering certification, and that neither of us have that certification. So you've got to take everything we say with a grain of salt. And with that, I guess we'll kick it off. Okay, yeah, so we're skipping ahead. Skipping way ahead?
No, we're going back. There we go.
Is that in sync with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Same thing.
So you already know who we are, and I'm not going to amplify on my stuff.
No, I'm good
okay,
to go
so
with introductions as well.
So, suffice it to say that we both do a lot of reverse engineering in our work and free time. And Pedram seems to have a lot more of that than I do, because he's about 10 times more productive than I am.
Because I don't sleep. Insomnia.
And I'm a hell of a lot older. But reverse engineering's got a lot of attention in the last year, and we want to talk about some of the events or incidents or things like that have made the news. In addition to talking about maybe what motivates us to do what we do, we'd like to hear what motivates you to do what you do, and ultimately help generate some discussion. One of the things I'm very interested in is what tools do we need to do this better. Okay, so I'll be interested later on in the talk to hear what stumbling blocks you've come across, what hurdles and so on, and why you couldn't get past them, what tools, if you have thought about the problem, what tools you think might help you get farther down your particular reverse engineering road. Okay?
Yeah. So kind of the breakdown of the talk today is going to be threefold. We'll start off with RE in the news over the past year. We'll talk about reverse engineering tools that have been developed for the past year and resources. And at the end of each section, we'll foster kind of like questions, and people can bring up other tools or resources and whatnot, and we'll just go back and forth. And just the one thing that we ask is that you introduce yourself before you speak, just so we can get on a name-to-name basis. Start.
Okay, so these are some of the things that we just picked out as things that we found interesting, and of course there may be many more, and please feel free, like when we get down to the bottom there, to jump up and point out something that you think was a fairly significant event or that involved reverse engineering. And the first one that I'm going to bring up is the whole Sony rootkit debacle from last fall, or this, whatever it was, October, November, just time frame, where, and I assume everybody's heard about this, yes? Okay, so we won't go down that road. But Mark Rusinovich, who runs sysinternals.com and writes some pretty impressive books, while the story as I know it, while working on his rootkit revealer tool, found some got some interesting results that he couldn't quite explain, and ultimately led him to understand that he'd effectively installed Sony's rootkit on his box. And I found it pretty interesting. His tool is fairly interesting, and we could let Jamie talk about perhaps the effectiveness of it or not at some other point. Maybe that's a discussion worth having. But using his tool and his skills and so on to then take apart the behavior and examine the behavior of that the DRM module that Sony was installing is one of the things I found. I followed that whole saga fairly closely, and was pretty interested in the tools and techniques, because he documented pretty well how he did it, and it's a nice example of more of a behavioral approach. I mean, he discovered most of what he found by looking at things that already happened to his box, using some of the tools that he's published, and less of a, he didn't have the binary in hand right away. He wasn't able to take it apart. And so if any of y'all went to the SandNets talk yesterday, okay, there's, you sort of have this behavioral approach to reverse engineering. Let that thing run. see what it does. What can we instrument? And there's pros and cons to that. And there's people whose skill sets fit better into that model than digging into the code with disassemblers and visualizers and things like that. So it's just something I wanted to point out and talk about that I think was a great example of positive impact of reverse engineering. I mean, if this stuff was outlawed, none of us would know about that, right? If somebody was clamping down and keeping us from talking about that, there is that danger out there. So if anybody wants to comment on that, please feel free. Otherwise, we're going to keep going down the list.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is, was the EULA, in this case with Sony Rootkit, did it make it illegal for Mark to do that reverse engineering?
I am not a lawyer, and I don't think
Well, I don't mean
Jennifer's in the room, but
whether or not the EULA was enforceable in court wasn't really my question. Did the EULA have language in it specifically to stop people from reverse engineering?
Does anybody know?
Yes.
It did?
Dan? And you want to amplify on that, or?
It's a standard quick wrap, right, license, so it spans the normal things, right? You don't have, I mean, this is all trumped by state law in most places.
Yeah.
But it said, you may not reverse engineer, you can file the obfuscate, disassemble.
But I mean, on that note, like Chris said, like he didn't really have to, he never pulled into disassembler. I mean, most of the things he did was high level, and he was able to discern kind of what was going on without having to, peek under the cover, so to say.
So does that mean that reverse engineering needs a more specific definition? Does it mean popping it into IDA, or does it mean watching it with one of Mark's own tools that you can download from his website?
But, I mean, yeah, I think that's a great question. The question is, does reverse engineering need maybe a more specific legal definition as to what activities you are allowed to conduct? And if somebody says in a click-wrap EULA, you cannot reverse engineer this product, does that mean you can't even observe the behavior of this product, or does that mean you can't pull it up in a disassembler? And that, and again, what's the purpose of your reverse engineering? Right? Your reverse engineering might be to build a compatible product, so you need to understand the inner workings of that product, and you basically want to bring a competitive product to market. Alternatively, you might be reverse engineering to find vulnerabilities, or you might be reverse engineering to figure out what the hell this thing did to your box, because it's malware or something like that. So I'm not aware of any good cases that have been taken to court. If anybody is, please feel free to stick your hand up, Dan, again.
Also, compatibility is all like from the 80s with Nintendo, and like it was either Acclaim or Activision. And they got taken to court by Nintendo because they made game cartridges that weren't licensed by Nintendo with a gold seal on it. And it went to court, and basically the court found that for compatibility reasons, you're allowed to reverse engineer as long as there's no harm to Nintendo if Acclaim or Activision made games, right? They sell more consoles. There's no harm to Nintendo just because they didn't go through Nintendo's licensing process. And they had an RE, Nintendo's game cartridge like architecture, and I figure out how to put everything in there. So that case has been used successfully since then to protect RE for compatibility reasons.
Right.
And
Okay.
Most of the click-wrap licenses are unenforceable in most cases. State law trumps a lot of it, depending on the state you're in.
And yet they continue to appear in EULAs, and so that's the sort of disheartening thing from my perspective is A, I never read them, but B, you never know where you're going to get hit over the head with.
It's a chilling effect, right? They want the ability to say, you violated this, therefore we can then stick our lawyers on you. We don't have to win, we can just delay you.
Right.
I'm actually also curious, like, what is the actual legally binding part? Is it when you read it and click it? Because I think I saw it on one of your blog postings, actually, Greg, where you just like pulled out the text file that it was reading it from, so the EULA came up blank. So is that technically no longer violating the EULA because you never actually saw and clicked on it?
There was a thread on the net that I read in regards to that, and several people seemed like they knew what you're talking about. But again, none of us are really legal experts, but they'd said that a judge would never hold that up. They would know that you purposely did that.
Right. It's about intent. It's
Yeah.
intent. Exactly.
Well, that's
And we haven't even gone down the DMCA road. So I don't even know. Is Jennifer still in town at the conference? Is she stuck in some other? It'd be really nice if somebody dragged her down here and we could maybe visit some of the legal aspects of reverse engineering after we get through the technical stuff. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Pedro to cover a couple of these, and then we're fortunate to have Greg Hoagland sitting right here in the front row who may talk about some of his Warden
Yeah,
stuff.
and, feel free. I mean, think of other news items that are kind of interesting for us to talk about. But the next thing that we thought of was the recent WMF vulnerability. For those of you who don't know, Ilfak Gilfanov, I think is pronounced. He is the lead developer on Data Rescue's IDA Pro. And so when this WMF thing came out, it was O-Day. There was no patch for it, and Ilfak for himself was nervous because he could not safely browse the web, in fear that he would get exploited by this bug. So he went ahead and reverse engineered the actual vulnerable code and figured out a binary patch which he distributed with a simple like click to install. So you didn't have to do anything like replace a DLL or hex edit anything. You double clicked, any home user could do it, and it received a lot of news. It was all over the place. I mean, I saw it on, I think maybe even at some point the CNN had picked up on, like an unofficial patch for this Microsoft bug. And so then the other interesting aspect of it is that when the patch finally came out by Microsoft, however many days, weeks later, it was actually very similar in the sense that instead of actually fixing the problem, it just removed functionality. And that's exactly what Ilfac's patch did, was it just removed the functionality of that specific vulnerable component, knowing that he didn't really need that to view most WMF files.
Well, the way the vulnerability worked, you really couldn't patch the vulnerability without removing the functionality. I mean, it wasn't really a vulnerability. It was a piece of functionality that Microsoft added, right? Like in this event, jump here and run this. That was their functionality. So there really was no other way to fix it.
Which is still interesting that some guy without access to the source, in his own time was able to put that out faster than, the actual company whose product it belongs to.
You actually find that surprising?
Let's slow down for a minute, one at a time, please. We have one question from Rich Johnson. If anyone has considered whether that was a backdoor.
Because the code itself had to be position independent assembly, like if it was just a callback function. So, this was functionality from what, the early 80s or something like that? I mean, I don't know. You would have to specifically be writing position independent code to put in there, just like shellcode. What do people think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept. For those of you who couldn't hear it, essentially was asking, what about the notion that this may have been a backdoor? Because of the way that the code was actually written, is it a possibility that perhaps this is what it was? This relic of the 1980s, you said. Go ahead.
I'm Dan. When he first released his patch, it actually wasn't complete because it broke a lot of services, like printing and stuff like that. And that's why Microsoft was delayed, because they wanted to make sure that they were not going to release a patch that. I'm not really defending them because I think they could have done this way faster, but they wanted to make sure everything was working. There was a second and third party patch that wasn't very popular that actually introduced more security vulnerabilities than it fixed.
Which one was that?
I don't remember his name. I saw him on one post on one site, and no one ever, someone took it apart and said, "Don't ever install that one."
Okay. Question against the wall?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was. Especially, just to kind of clarify part of this is, it's not that they couldn't come up with the patch, it's they were deliberately not releasing it to avoid bad press. Because you notice once there was bad press, it showed up like that. So I don't know if anybody else has to deal with Windows boxes, but that's sure the hell how it looked to me. So I don't know if, it could even look the same. I don't think it was a technical issue, it was just an organizational thing. So I don't know if that makes a difference for who's thinking, but I think that's even worse than not being able to figure it out, is figuring out and saying, well, our business model doesn't support patching for you yet. So.
And there was one more. Did you want to?
Yeah, I've heard a lot about the OPEX patch, and it was great work. And praise them for releasing it so quickly, and Microsoft for releasing it so slow. But what did OPEX test it on first? I mean, and who was you accountable to if this patch fucked something up?
That's true, actually. You are.
Well, he's not accountable to anybody because you voluntarily installed the patch. He's not, in my opinion.
But it was pushed out to a lot of people, and it was told that this is the end all be all. This is your fix. Go install this.
I think the interesting.
I don't know if he made that.
I think the interesting. Ilfac didn't push the patch to anybody. An interesting phenomena that came out of this was Sans came up and said, "There is a third-party patch available for this. Install it. Trust us." And a lot of people said, "Well, who the hell is Ilfac?" I mean, a lot of us know who Ilfac is because we use his tools, and we may implicitly trust in his skills because we interact with him from time to time. But I thought that was an interesting phenomena. Install this third-party patch, which would, not that there's a warranty on your product, but it could, in theory, invalidate your product. Your warranty, whatever implied. Dell says you install that patch. No, okay, we're not helping you. I don't know. That potential outcome. Dan, you got your hand raised.
I mean, and that's the thing, right? There was no, Ilfac aside, even if you get Microsoft's patch, there's an attestation by Microsoft that this is the vendor-supplied patch, but that's not under warranty. You have no legal recourse if that patch doesn't work, yourself, right? Just like, the reason why they get away with this in the first place is because get away with is kind of strong language, but legally, they don't have to provide you a patch, and when you get hacked or when somebody takes advantage of a vulnerable exploit in Windows, you have no legal recourse for that, right? Like already, there is no warranty on any of that anyway. So the only thing here is who
The
do you
warranty
trust?
is not the question. Is does it actually work and work well?
No, I thought your question was more. Well, I thought your question. Maybe I'm wrong. I thought your question was about ILFAC versus Microsoft and what is who's accountable.
Well,
Legal responsibility. Was it properly tested against all operating systems?
well, the answer is no, and I think ILFAC posted in his blog, in fact, that he had only tested it on a small subset of all Windows variants. So,
Going to send to download it, we're reading his blog.
I mean, again, that's not ILFAC's fault. Like, he wrote it mostly for his own purposes. Yeah.
ILFAC did great work. I'm knocking the people at SANS that were pushing it.
I think it was an odd phenomenon. I think it's really the first time we've come out with a third-party patch to a security vulnerability in a major, a widely used piece of software. And it's one of the things perhaps we talk about a lot. Why do you do reverse engineering? I want to find bugs and fix them. Well, nobody does that. I mean, you find bugs and exploit them, or you find bugs. You're going to fix them locally, or you're going to interact with the vendor. And if you go down we can go down the whole disclosure, but there was a BOF on that. If you're going to interact with the vendor and say, here's what I found, why don't you fix it, right? Normally, you don't see a lot of these interim fixes pushed by security researchers.
Hold on a second. Did you install the patch for RealFact? No. Who installed the patch? How many people installed the patch for RealFact? Yeah?
Hey, let the record show that there are.
Yourselves. How many installed yourself? On your own machines, did you recommend it to your friends and family? You recommended it to your friends and family. So then why is it a bad thing that SANS was recommending it to everyone else?
SANS was recommending it on an enterprise scale level.
Well, but that's an enterprise issue of testing and
Well,
validation on the enterprise.
I think I want to get moved on from this subject, but I think it's you got the vendor who's not recommending it, and you have an independent organization that is recommending it, going contrary to what Microsoft would have you do. And so we have this contrary positions, and who do you trust? Do you trust the person who wrote the original software, or do you trust this sort of independent organization? And I'm not trying to badmouth SANS, but I think it just created this interesting sort of situation.
As far as Microsoft's concerned, we know who we trust.
Well, they'll tell you who to trust, but right.
Secure also recommends
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to cut anybody off. I mean, we just kind of wanted to bring this up because it was reverse engineering related, and we can continue this political debate all day long, but we only have half an hour left, so move on. Last news item. Go to the resources and tools, and we can visit this again, in the hallways and whatnot. But I mean, all interesting points. So the last kind of newsy item that we came up with was Greg's discovery of the questionable rootkit from World of Warcraft. Their Warden client. Did you actually name that, or was that?
The Warden is the name that the developers at Blizzard gave.
Yeah. So I mean, essentially, for those of you who don't know, what it does is it was designed to, and correct me if I'm wrong, to block cheating programs. So it would scan through your entire list of windows and look for something that matches the same window name as a cheating tool, and close it out. And so I mean, Greg.
It was a pretty advanced anti-cheating solution. How it worked was when you authenticated to their game server, it would download a single page of code to you. It was position independent, very much like shellcode. A heap was allocated, it was placed into that heap, and it was then patched into the control path. It was called once every 15 seconds. Every time you logged in, it could be different. And I had a group of developers I was working with, and we all tested our own accounts. We all had different versions of it. So it was very difficult to write a defense against their Warden client. Of course, I'm cheating at the game, right? And I want to continue to cheat.
So the motivation here in this case being that.
I wrote a robot program that would automatically fight my character and pick up gold and do all this rinky-dink stuff, right? Because the game was so boring, I actually didn't really want to play it myself. So this Warden client caught me doing it, and it caught a lot of other people too. There was a development group that I was working with overseas who had a program called Wow Sharp, and it was catching everybody, and they turned off Wow Sharp for a while to protect the user base. And the fellow that was running it was considering shutting it down. And at that point, he said, wait, give me a chance. I'm going to try to write a rootkit to get around the Warden. And so I used Jamie and Sherry Sparks' memory subversion tricks that they presented at Black Hat this last year to get around. So it's a very advanced form of cheating, I guess. At this point.
Hey, you gotta do what you gotta do.
Again,
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. And there's other programs, Infotech, Punkbuster, two other ones, games in general are very much starting to use this anti-cheating stuff. And here's a program you might be familiar with if you play poker. It's called Party Poker.
Oh, yeah.
They take full screenshots of your entire desktop and mail them to an analyst. There's an analyst at a computer, and he looks through there. Whatever's on your screen, he's going to see it. And he's looking for third-party programs that are tracking other players. This is very common for a person to have a tracking running. He finds a weak table where there's a lot of players who don't play very well, and then he'll get into that game so he can clean house.
Yeah. So there you have it. 3 motivations of reverse engineering, cheating, unofficial patching, and, figuring out what's going on. Yeah, monetary. I mean, is there any other news before we move on, kind of the other sections? Anybody else wants to bring up? No? Let's continue on. So the second thing we wanted to cover is just, the kind of resources that popped up in the past year. In general, it seems that there's more attention given to reverse engineering, and there's more, user-friendly forums and documentation, and people are sharing a little bit more. So, the first one is somewhat of a self-plug, although it has nothing really to do with me, is the past year I started OpenRCE, reversecodeengineering.org, and it's a community site very much designed after Greg and Jamie's rootkit.com, but the focus of it being, reverse engineering, of course. So, I highly hope and recommend that you guys will go and check it out and contribute. And if you have any ideas in terms of what to add to it, I'm pretty good at the whole web app development thing. So go ahead.
Can I edit my fat-fingered posts now?
Yeah, you can. That was done a long time ago. See, people like you not logging back in. I make all sorts of changes you don't see. Another thing that popped up is Steve McAuliffe wrote this IDA SDK reference manual, and to my knowledge, this is the first public attempt, a free resource where he really went through a lot of work. He has a lot of code snippets. He gives a really good background on what the different sections are for, what the different APIs are for. For anybody who's written an IDA plugin before, you'll know it's very difficult to do because the SDK is not documented, and the IDC, the scripting language, which is documented, the names don't match in the SDK, so you can't do any kind of grepping there. So really, it's kind of a crapshoot. You have to, if I want to write, for example, a comment in a plugin, I'm going to have to do some guessing on what ILFAC might have named that function, and Steve's done a lot of work to kind of, further that along to make it easier for people to write plugins. Building on top of that, for anybody who's ever written PHP code, you'll see they have, their documentation, in my opinion, is really, really good. You can go to any given function, and that function will have the actual PHP documentation and the documentation for how to use it, and then they have user-select comments underneath it. So I mean, just searching through those forums, it's a very good way to learn and use the language as a reference. And so I modeled after that. I took all the things that Steve wrote and put it on OpenRCE, and it's searchable in the same exact way with user comments and editable by admins, and you can add new functions and structures and whatnot. So, again, nobody has actually edited it. So, I mean, I would love to see, I know there's people in this room that write plugins, I'd love to see people go and when they figure out how to use, the funky choose to create, window list API to actually write down how they did it for the benefit of everybody else. You wanted to cover
yeah, I'll say that this SDK reference manual is a great give back to the reverse engineering community. That thing is a small book. It's a couple hundred pages.
Yeah,
it's PDF. It's massive, and it covers the most commonly used stuff. But there's still massive areas of the SDK that haven't been covered. And of course, the problem with the SDK is it's published but not supported for standard IDE users. Anybody have SDA support or SDK support? I mean, you pay a fortune for it, I guess.
Yeah, I do.
Are you allowed to say what it costs?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't write the check. It's my company.
Yeah, but ILFAC will sell you SDK support. He just doesn't want to be answering the questions all the time, taken away from.
Does the SDK currently support the debugging interface that IDA has, or is it still just for the static analysis?
I believe it does,
It has debugging.
and I think that in the reference manual are there's some discussion of how to get in and access that debugging API. Okay. But along those, ILFAC has also started a blog. How he has time, I have no idea. And this is one of the first places where he started talking about his patch for the WMF thing. But it's nice to see him out there blogging a little bit, and he shows up interesting techniques. I often wonder, how does ILFAC use IDA? Yeah. And if he's so busy wrapped up in developing the thing, it's interesting to see his uses and his solutions to some interesting problems. So I'll point that out as a reference. He's talked about some ways he uses the debugger, some ways to get around the sort of simple things like is debugger present type calls while you're running his code, and talked about other things like loading up multiple PEs into one IDA database. So you can get all not only the executable, but any DLLs that the thing might load, all in that one IDA database. So you can watch calls back and forth. And then, then there's a variety of books that came out this year, some of which I have, most of which I've never read all the way through, but all of which have very interesting sections that pertain to me and may pertain to you in other contexts. And what about I too am an author, and that's all I'll say about that. I'm not into the pimping my book stuff, so.
Do you know of any decent OllyDebug documentation?
Oh, OllyDebug itself has like the PDK, or what are you talking about? The actual, how to use it or how to write tools for it?
Like PDK reference manual or
I
something.
mean, I personally think the OllyDebug documentation is amazing. Like, I mean, this one guy wrote this great tool, and he documented the hell out of it. Like, the PDK is very readable, and it's fully documented. And if you, I mean, just going through the Windows help file that comes with it, there's a lot of stuff there. There is one useful OllyDebug forum. I mean, of course, you can use OpenRC as well. It's like ollydebug.win32 assembly or something like that. Yeah, I mean, that's the only other one I know of that, it's an okay resource, but I mean, for the most part, OllyDebug itself answers all the questions I have about it. Anything else? No?
Any other resources that people find particularly interesting or useful or?
Yeah.
XE tools? Okay. And you get what there? XE tools?
There's just a bunch of stuff.
Okay.
What about in terms of like things that you would like to see? In terms of documentation or form?
One right.
Unpackers that will run in Linux that will handle all of about 500 types of packing that is now going on, malware.
So an actual tool that will do that, or documentation?
There's a UPX unpacker, there's a UPX unpacker that will run in Linux. It'll unpack Windows UPX files. There's also an FSG that will run. But if you look, there's one tool, I forget what it's called, it runs in Windows, that has just under 600 unpackers built into it. And we can sure use something like that in Linux.
What's that tool? What's the name of that tool?
I'll have
What is
to
the
look.
name of
I got it.
X86 emulator.
No.
Yeah, I can get you the name.
I have it somewhere written down as well, yeah. But I mean, actually more important than that is, like, it'd be interesting, and this is something, again, like, I thought that would be a useful thing to have, is just a central repository for notes on packers and unpackers. And again, I know I'm pimping the hell out of this, but OpenRCE, it has under the reference library a section for packers, and if you want, you can sign up for an account on it, and you can add new ones. So I had, somebody had started to put together some notes, I think there's a dozen or so, and he has things like, the entry point signature, so what to look at, or look at to see, like, which packer it is, where to go to set a breakpoint to stop it from unpacking. I mean, that is, a resource that would benefit from people adding to it and growing further. Somebody else had a, go ahead.
Have people seen ROM.UI? Has anybody ever seen ROM.UI? These guys are hacking like ROMs. They're basically taking the BIOS images and like modifying the BIOS images and then bringing them back. They publish their own BIOS images.
Go ahead, let me start.
What's that?
Go ahead, let me.
Pedram's taking notes. We're trying to capture your ideas, so you may have a great idea, and a nice thing would be to capture it. And one of the things that Pedram may do is put up on OpenRCE a sort of. I mean, he's got a whole to-do list for OpenRCE, but it'd be like a community-wide to-do list. And you may have an idea, but you may not know how to go about implementing the tool. And somebody else may not think of the idea, and if they hear it, and it might be a natural fit for a tool they happen to be developing. So that's one of the reasons I'm kind of interested in hearing this stuff come out.
This whole typing thing that I was doing, like at the end of this, we'll put it up on the web. Anything that people had mentioned, the other different resources, the slides, all that, we'll put it on the web so you don't have to, memorize it or take notes while you're here.
Greg's got it.
I was going to make a note about your first book you have listed there. That's the best book on reverse engineering I've ever read. And I'd like to, for anybody who hasn't read it yet or does have a copy, maybe just thumb through it, I recommend you look actually at Appendix A and Appendix B. Those two appendices are the most valuable thing in that book.
And the author's name there is Eldad Ilium.
Yes.
So you can look that up. Anything else? Go ahead.
Better support for embedded systems, at least in the open source community. I mean, you can go to proprietary hardware manufacturers and get some debugging tools, but stuff that's available, like a lot of the firmware RE stuff, being able to figure out what the file formats are for the firmware and being able to then give the RE that code.
How many people do that in this audience? Yeah, so you got two guys. You guys are.
And IDA Advanced doesn't meet your needs?
Well, if you can get the firmware in the sub-readable file format that I understand, yeah, and actually trying to get the firmware off the device. And yeah, I'm doing a lot with trying to reverse a lot of the radio cards.
Yeah, you're in a tough spot there. You're in a niche of a niche. Like it's gonna be real difficult for you to find.
But if you figure it out and you write the loaders, I'm sure ILFAC would love to have them and turn them around and.
Make money off of it.
Well, he does make money, obviously, but I think a lot of the loaders that he gets contributed, he includes in his product that he'll sell you. So.
I guess we'll just
But
move on then. Nobody else?
he'll give out your source code. A lot of his loaders he doesn't give out the source code for. Some of the loaders he does, the ones that are contributed by the community.
Let's move on.
Yeah, go ahead.
Does not want to update. There we go. So the last kind of section is just talking about the tools that have come out, and there's some other ones that we haven't mentioned here. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but IDA Python is a very flexible and useful tool that Gergely, I won't even pronounce his last name, from F-Secure put together, and Eero Carrera, who was also at F-Secure at the time, had written a lot of things on top of it. Like he wrote this REML, which is the reverse engineering meta language. I mean, what these guys have done is they've embedded a Python interpreter into IDA, and so you have full access to 3 forms of actually controlling IDA. And it's actually a little bit confusing in the beginning to get used to, because you have access to the IDC API, you have access to the SDK API, and then you have access to their own Python library that they've written on top of it. 3 ways of doing the same things. For example, if you want to enumerate all the functions in the IDA binary, you can do it using the IDC, the SDK, or like for func in functions, very Python-ish. So it's a little bit of a learning curve to get used to, but I'm surprised it hasn't picked up kind of like more support behind it, because it's very useful for prototyping tools, and a lot faster than you could, for example, write an actual plugin. Did you have something to say?
As far as I know, IDA Python hasn't been ported to 4.9. It's only 4.8.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of changes to the SDK that's keeping him from. He does have like a beta release, and I mean, I have it on my laptop, and it breaks in a lot of different ways. But I would say that in the near future, you should have that. I mean, my other complaint about it is that it is built against, like the binary version is built against Python 2.3, and like I have Python 2.4, but the quick hack to that is just a symbolic link. It works just fine. So if you ever.
And, one thing we hope is that ILFAC has claimed that he's frozen the API, the SDK API, starting with 4.9, and perhaps things will stop breaking with each new release of IDA. So.
And we want to put bets on that?
I said perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, that would be one very useful thing. I mean,
I would love it. I mean, I have no reason to disbelieve him, so.
Yeah. Like I have like 3 versions of IDA installed because I never got around to updating some plugins that I use. Like I don't want to go through the hassle of recompiling them.
He may freeze the API, but he may decide next week that you shouldn't use SNPrintf anymore, and so we, do some weird undef.
You want to talk about?
Oh yeah, so visualization, and I'm unfortunately not, I haven't been brought into the visualization age. So I guess my job is to talk about the lack of quality visualization tools, and then let Pedram talk about things he's done in that space. Anybody who's used IDA, I find that while the graphs are interesting, they are very difficult to use as IDA has implemented them, because they're so poorly. He's got a basic graphing tool, and you can show it, but you're quickly overwhelmed by the complexity of the graph and the lack of interactivity in the graph that is produced. So. Even if you want to follow something down, just follow the calls out of a function or calls into a function, it gets pretty nasty pretty quick. And WinGraph is not the most useful of graphing tools for getting stuff out. So I'm pretty much a straight disassembly person. But
Surprised you don't have AT&T's tool listed here.
The graph is? But it's not really, I mean, people have put it in there. Like we'll mention, I mean, kind of, so in general, there's been like a large push for visualization over the past year. Like you've had F-Secure, they used a Blender to make that 3D visualization of malware. Arrow has PyDot, and so with PyDot plus IDA Python, you can create arbitrary WinGraph visualizations. I mean, I didn't put WinGraph in there. I'm sorry, Graph is in there just because it's not like nobody has like natively like put it in there. So what is it? Halvar came out with this BinNavi tool that uses this fantastic Java graphing library, which is very expensive, and does that. IDA 5.0 is going to have a graphing interface to it. last year at Recon, I put out Process Stalker, which uses this freeware tool called Aureus to do graphing and visualization and tracking. I know Greg's got commercial tools that do that. So there's been a lot of push for visualization. And for me, I cannot look at a dead listing. I need to see those control flows, and I enjoy seeing the color and being able to move things around. I look at this, I'm pushing it aside, or this might be interesting, I'll mark it as a color. That's the only way that I will look at a disassembly dead listing. And of course,
I tend to agree with you. Once you've gone to the visualization age, you go to Chris, you can't go back. It's like going back to a 1400 baud modem.
Yeah.
I just can't do it. There's not even play.
My hard thing is, what's interesting in that visualization? Where's the interesting? Where do I need to go next? How do I drill into that?
I can give you an example.
Yeah.
what information are you adding with the?
Well, I understand what information you're adding with visualization, but that's always the question whenever you try to find a new user interface or something, is what is for the pain of switching this user interface, what is the new information I'm adding, right?
See, I'm of the reverse opinion is that the pain is the original interface. I want to alleviate the pain by. And actually, just by a show of hand, who relies more on visualization than they do on the dead listing? So and how many people just look straight dead listing? Well, you're all old and stubborn. Move on, get with it.
All the information's there if you can visualize it in your head, but some of us have that.
Oh, I see how it is.
I like those lines. I'm in the left margin. I like the control flow lines and stuff like that. But
It works together. You guys mentioned what kind of tools you want. One of the tools I want more of is free profilers for just general runtime code. VTune is out there, and you got to pay a lot of money for it. I think AMD has one that they either charge less for, or that they give you free if you're an AMD supported developer.
yeah, part of it's our space. If I do a lot of obfuscated malware, and a graph does me nothing.
Right.
I can graph through 10 instructions before.
If it's obfuscated, are you unpacking it or something first?
Yes, which is I have this x86 emulator plugin that I use in IDA, and so I unpack it in IDA, so I don't have to go out and find something that's going to take a memory snapshot. And we've all gone through the hassle of trying to use Lord PE, and the question, where do you make it stop? Right? Where's the entry point? And I've looked at some really nasty stuff where that's not an obvious. There's no obvious answer to that. How many instructions do you want to execute 10,000 instructions? Stop, take a look, or it's just hard to know when to stop and when to quit or when to snapshot. And
the thing that visualization really gives me is for program understanding. Of course, you look at a dead listing and you're actually drilling down on a function, but to know what functions are around, where is it situated, that gives you a lot of valuable context. The biggest problem I have when I'm reverse engineering isn't reverse engineering a snippet of code, it's determining what code to look at in the first place.
Right.
And a lot of these visualization tools kind of come in combined with profiling tools. So it's not just viewing a dead graph. It's a graph combined with a runtime debugger. So it tells you, okay, you have this big massive graph that you can't read. Well, let's get a subset of that. Let's see all the blocks and functions that you hit and just show those. And then from there, let's highlight things that might be of further interest. So it's a combination of filtering and visualization. It's not just visualization.
It's letting the visualization elements
Yeah.
tie into the runtime state, right? Being able to display something graphically as program's happening. That's useful.
And I'm of the opinion that one of the reasons why the visualization hasn't picked up as much is because it's all external to the de facto tool that people use. Even IDA's built-in visualization is this external program. It's WinGraph. BinNavi is external. Process Stalker is external. I think everybody's graphing tools are pretty much external. Which is nice about IDA 5 is it has this thing built in, and we have screenshots of it actually. So this is, you've all seen WinGraph. So now IDA's disassembly view can actually be turned into a graph. So imagine the same exact disassembly view, but it's now been converted into broken down into these different nodes. And so you can do anything you could normally do within these graphs. So I can change names, follow cross-references, double-click on an edge to go to it. Anything that you would have otherwise been able to do. Add a structure. Whatever you can do in IDA, you can do through these graphs. Just 1 second. This is a zoomed-in version of it. Kind of what he has is that title bar is the start of every single basic block. And then you'll see 3 colored squares there. So if you click on the first one, it'll change that block to the color of it's a user-defined color. So you can make blue, green, whatever. And you can follow cross-references. You can rename the entire basic block. He's tied the debugger into it, so it'll flash the actual edge that it's about to take before it does a jump. And this is all built right into IDA. Like you can right-click, do text view, right-click, do graph view. So I think with this and the plugins that will start being built on top of this graphing engine, we'll start to see more of kind of a push towards visualization apps.
Additionally, you can drag these things around, so you can rearrange the graph on your own, and you can collapse blocks and so on. So you can sort of prune things and hide things that you don't want to see, and that's what I need, because I just get overwhelmed. I want to collapse entire subtrees and things like that in a function call graph, so I can just sort of focus on the one path without all that other clutter. And I think we're going there, and I'll probably get there eventually. But
that is what this is in this example. Like you see two nodes that were collapsed away. That was unnecessary logging logic in whatever this binary was that I was looking at. And if you collapse it in the graph, it actually collapses within the IDA view as well.
You were using this?
Yeah.
So you have the beta?
Yeah. Sorry, I neglected to. It'll come out soon though.
and all this functionality is going to be accessible via the IDA API, the plugin API.
Are you going to build a plugin that takes like the IDA graph into Process Stalker?
Well, see, that's I have held off on the change that I want to make to Process Stalker for that very reason. Because now this is built in, I mean, it's going to be so much easier to be able to do things like internally. Like one thing I'd love to see is, here's a basic block. I'm at it. I want to see the kind of data that goes into it. Click on it, say, tell me what's going to be in this, and launch the IDA debugger. Remotely attach whatever process it is, and then when it hits there, read the values and tell me in it again. So this integration, like I've been excited about it. So I can't wait to see what he's exposed to the SDK.
Also, I just wanted to mention for the people that do use Process Stalker, there's been a WinDebug port, and
Yeah.
you're a WinDebug user rather than AllDebug or whatever.
Yeah, an anonymous contributor put together to really, because now you can do kernel stock. So because it's a WinDebug plugin, you can you can stock anything that WinDebug can attach to. And I'm going to, in the near future, put an updated release. So thanks for reminding me on that, actually. And of course, it'll be up on OpenRC.
Is there like an ad hoc survey as to like WinDebug versus AllDebug versus soft dice? Like everybody versus AllDebug, raise their hand.
So we're looking at AllDebug users raising their hand.
Okay, then WinDebug. WinDebug rules.
You can't raise two hands. That doesn't count.
And then soft ice, finally.
I was just curious.
So it's a pretty even split between. And what about everybody else? They just don't use debugger?
Who uses GDB?
That's interesting. All right, moving on. You want to talk about x86MU and kind of what Rich is
I
saying?
want to kind of blow through the rest of this, and then we'll finish up with discussion. I built a plugin called the x86 emulator, which is I don't know if you call it a pseudo debugger or what have you. 5 minutes, and that's where I do my stuff, because I don't want to get out of IDA. I don't want to work back and forth between IDA and Ollie and all this other stuff, and how far should I run it in Ollie? Where should I set that breakpoint so I can unpack to such and such a point? And then you're still left with the problem of, my database doesn't look like that, right? Okay, it doesn't look, so I want the database to look like the unpacked binary, and that's the idea. And so it just saves state, and you can work your way through it, and it's evolving rapidly lately. And one of the things I think I'd like to do now is Pedro's got Process Stalker, where he basically grabs a lot of information out of IDA, and then he shoots it over to set automatically a bunch of breakpoints in Ollie, and I can sort of do breakpoint stuff there. So I might take his stuff and redirect it to the emulator, and then free run there and capture a bunch of state. And I'll let him talk about, well, I don't know if we're going to do demos of
Yeah,
Process
we're kind of
Stalker or
like
not.
running out of time with like 8 minutes left.
Yeah.
And the last two things we want to talk about was like
Quick question from Rich.
Yeah.
Yeah, just real quick, I wanted to let everybody know that x86 emulator is a great tool.
Yeah.
I wrote my structure recognition code on top of it. Chris is really helpful if you want to hack on the code a little bit. I just appreciate the collaboration we've had a little bit. It's a little fun grinding session.
Thanks.
Yeah, if you have any questions, his phone number is 403. Call him directly and answer the.
And I just
Dan?
wanted to say thanks to both you guys for both the tools and all the tools you guys are building out.
Make me blush.
Are you trying to get us out of here? Are you trying to end our talk?
So, yeah,
The rest of the stuff is like sort of diffing techniques, and I don't think we're going to go down that path.
and we thought it would be interesting. Like we listed all like the different between the two publicly available bin diffing tools, or publicly as in you can actually buy it, or freeware. IDA Compare. Dave Zimmer wrote. He's at IDAFence right now. It's an interesting tool built on IDA, and of course everybody knows Halvar's Sabre bin diff. So we kind of put together the list of all the different heuristics that combined and otherwise not used you could use to do binary diffing. So if we had time, we thought it would be interesting for us to kind of just throw out the cons. Maybe people can come up with new ideas or shoot some of those ideas down. And we also had something on collaborative engines and where that's going, and if people want to see more on that. So let's just open up the floor since we have so little time left. Yeah, the last thing was kind of like what we're building.
Oh, that was it, right?
Which we don't have time to talk about. But and we can just stop right here and kind of
So,
open up
like
the
I said
floor.
up front, Lorraine, go ahead.
What do you guys use to debug on Linux?
I don't debug on Linux.
I use the IDA x86 emulator.
I don't do it on Linux. I mean, if anybody else wants to.
Well, it doesn't say. I think was her caveat.
What about IDA's? Have you tried IDA's remote?
After playing with it, what other techniques do you use it?
I mean, I personally think the IDA debugger is hideous. Like, I could not have designed a worse user interface if I tried. You know, if we sat here and talked about how to make it unreadable, we just couldn't do a better job of it. I cannot. I despise the IDA debugger. The IDA debugger? You can. I mean,
Now you can attach. It's amazing. They added that feature.
So, question: how many people are mostly Win32 RE type folks? Linux RE folks, other systems, embedded systems, things like that.
What do the rest of y'all do?
Attend cons. No? Okay.
Is there anything else? Talk about tools that other people are building or want to see built. IDASync, I've been kept really busy transitioning in my new job. There's a new, I'm working on something called RE-Sync. It's like the next version of it. It'll be like more open-ended, and the actual protocol will not be, like colon delimited. So people will be able to easily add tools to it. So at one point I'll finish that up and put it out. But I haven't. I have a subversion version that has the stack variables. You can change those as well. That was contributed by somebody who also wanted to remain anonymous, but I haven't had a chance to put it out yet. So I apologize for that.
I think we're about to get kicked out. But any other questions before we wrap it up? Okay. Doesn't look like it. So I'd like to thank you all for coming, and we're available for the rest of the con, basically.